Hey guys, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to part 4 of my Music Theory for Producers course. In the last video, we talked about some of the basic rhythms that we could have: whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note, 16th note, and we worked completely within 4/4 time or common time. I think at the end of the last video, I said we were going to move on to some other meters, but I'm actually going to save that for the next video, because in this video, I want to talk about 3 different rhythmic values that kind of use the other values that we've talked about, but are a little bit different. I want to talk about dotted rhythms, tied rhythms, and triplet rhythms. So one of the rhythmic values that we took a look at in the previous video was the 2/16ths followed by an 8, and an 8th followed by 2/16ths. And it sounds like this. So that's what that rhythm sounds like. I'll just put that in a loop. So what if we wanted a rhythm that was not an 8th note, but not a quarter note? Remember, you can fit 2 8th notes within a quarter note. But let's say we wanted a rhythm that was in between an 8th note and a quarter note. The rhythmic value in between would essentially be an 8th note plus half of its value, which is a 16th note. Remember, we can fit 2 16ths into an 8th. So essentially what I'm saying is, what if we were to join together these 2 notes so that I essentially had an 8th note and a half? Let's do that. And I'm gonna do that with the glue tool in my piano roll editor. We're gonna glue together this 16th and quarter note, or 16th and 8th note here. And we get this. So what happens is it creates these little lines in between the joined 8th note and joined 16th note. And what the tie does, this is a tied rhythm. What ties do is they essentially join together 2 rhythms. So the first note's going to be stated, the second note will be stated, but then this third note is just going to be an extension of the second note. So it's going to sound like this. Notice that we only hear 2 stated notes. Let's try the same thing over here, but instead of joining together something on the right side of each group, let's join together the 8th note and the 16th note on the left side of each group. So we'll do this. Again, I'm going to use my glue tool, and once again use my glue tool. Now it creates something that looks kind of funky as well. We get this little dot. Now, dotted rhythms, a dot symbol next to a note essentially means adding half of the value of the note to that note. So you'll notice that when we join these together, the first 16th note disappeared. And essentially, a tied note is the same thing as a dotted note. So a dotted 8th note really is just an 8th note plus half of an 8th note's value. So an 8th note plus a 16th note. So why is it notated 2 separate ways? If we play this, you'll hear that just this note plays and then that one. Now these 2 rhythms are not the same thing, but they have a similar feature in that they have an 8th note and a 16th note tied or dotted. You can actually notate all of this with just dots. I just clicked the syncopation button over here, and instead of using the tied value for these, it goes with the dotted value. So they really are, dotted values and tied values can be are essentially the same thing. The reason why one is used over another is when a tied value or a dotted value is used on the back end of a group, it just tends to look cleaner this way, and it's easier for musicians to read. When a dotted value or tied value is on the front end of a group, they tend to go with the dot as opposed to the tie, because it's easier to read and it looks cleaner. So all it has to do with is tradition. Once again, like we've talked about before, music theory steeped in all this tradition. And it's essentially a scoring or drafting technique just to make it just looks prettier this way as opposed to this way, and it's a little bit easier to read. So now let's try this with quarter notes. I've got a rhythm here that's a quarter and 2 8ths, a quarter and 2 8ths. So let's say we wanted to join together this quarter and this 8th note. Let's try that. Let's drag over them up here, use the glue tool, paste them together, and as you can see, we get a dotted quarter note followed by 1/8 note. So a dotted quarter note is a quarter note plus half of a quarter note's value, which is an 1/8 note. Likewise, if we sort of did this the other way around, kind of like we did earlier, like if I did 2/8 and a quarter, like this, 2/8 and a quarter, and I wanted to join together, say, the last two notes of the group here, we could do that. And again, because it's on the back end of the group, it ends up using a tie instead of a dotted value, but we can click on the syncopation button and it will default to the dotted value instead. So again, it's more about drafting, and it just looks cleaner and it's easier to read that way. So tied values and dotted values are in many ways very, very similar, and in a lot of situations exactly the same. Pretty much any value can be dotted. Let's try something with like whole notes and half notes. Let's just extend our MIDI region here out to 2 measures. So what I'm going to do is just create a whole note here. And remember, we said a whole note just looks like a little circle here, and it basically extends for the full value of 1 measure of music, or at least in 4/4 time. It's 4 beats. But what if I wanted something to be 3 beats? Well, if we take a half note and 2 quarter notes, and let's say we wanted to join together this half note, which is 2 beats, and the quarter note, which is 1 beat, to be 3 beats, you drag over those, glue those together, and we end up with a dotted half note. So again, the dot says that we're adding half the value of the half note to itself. So a half note plus a quarter note. And technically even whole notes can be dotted, except when you dot a whole note, it becomes 6 beats. The only problem is in this particular meter, 4/4 time, there's only 4 beats per measure. So we can't, in 4/4, we can't have a dotted half or a dotted whole note. But in other meters that have more than 4 beats, you can actually have dotted. Whole notes. Now let's look at a tie from one other situation. Let's say that I play a chord or something, or a bass line, and I want the bass just to be a big long drone, and I want it to extend from measure 1 here all the way into measure 2, right? So what if I want to join these 2 notes together to create one really long note? Well, the tie can be used to join notes across bar lines as well. So anytime you want a note to basically just extend its value into the next measure, that's another situation where you can use a tied value. So let's just listen to this real quick. And notice that it doesn't restate the note at the downbeat of the measure, because this is all considered one note. All right, so that's tied values and dotted values. Let's take a look at triplet values. Now, for all these examples, like I said before, we've been working in 4/4 time. We have also been working at a grid value of a 16th note, a grid division of a 16th note. That's the default for Logic. That's the default for a lot of DAWs. And that basically means that each one of these little grid lines in the piano roll equals a 16th note. So if we were to just draw notes to those grid lines, we would end up with something that has a bunch of 16th notes in it, just like so. And if we change that grid value to, say, an 1/8 note, you'll see that the grid values are now a little bit wider. And if we draw into those values, we end up with the 1/8 notes. So that's what the grid values up here do. And this is a common thing in pretty much all DAWs, is choosing what you want your grid values to be. So we know what 4 is. It's a quarter note. 8 is an 1/8 note. 16 is a 16th note. And then with 32nd notes, 64th notes, 128th notes, and beyond, like really fast values that we're not really going to see too much. But what about these ones in between? We've got like this /12. 12. What the heck is a 12th note? Well, let's click on that. And let's see what it does. What the 12th note does is it basically creates a rhythmic value where we have 12 divisions per measure. Now I do have to change one little thing down here to make this display properly. There we go. So you'll hear our rhythm is 16ths, and then 2/8, and then these things, or they look like 3/8 notes joined together with a little 3 on top of it. So let's see what this sounds like. So these are triplet values. Triplets are values that are in groups of 3 as opposed to being in groups of 2 or 4 like they are over here with 16th and 8th notes. So triplet values are great for songs where you want like kind of like a natural swing to it. I mean, there is a difference between swing and triplets, but like think of Michael Jackson's "The Way You Make Me Feel." The bass line and that goes bum 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 bum, and it's a triplet feel. It's got this da 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 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 sort of feel to it. That's a song with a triplet feel as opposed to a straight feel, like bum 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 bum. Or take like Billie Jean, another Michael Jackson song. The bass line from Billie Jean is straight 8th notes. Bum 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 bum. So that's 2 examples of like a song that has like more a straight time to it, 8th notes and 16ths, versus a triplet feel. So songs can have either of these 2 feels, a triplet feel or a straight feel, or both. I mean, depending on what you're working with, or maybe just one little value or one little melody can have some triplets in it. Now, there are other types of triplets. If we keep going up the list here, we have 16th notes, which we know what that is, and 32nd notes. But what about this 24th note? Well, this is going to further make the grid values even shorter. And if we type in a bunch of these notes, so now we have 16th note triplets. So essentially this means you can fit 3 triplet 16th notes, a group of 3, into the space of 1 8th note or 2 16th notes. Or if you want to look at it this way, you can fit 6 16th triplets into 1 quarter note. So this is a beat, this is a beat, this is a beat, and this is a beat. So let's listen to this whole thing just so we can hear what all of these rhythms sound like. So those are pretty fast. So let's hear this in an actual musical example. I'll be right back. I'm going to do this off screen, but I'll create a couple musical examples, one with straight values with ties and dots, and I'll create another one in a triplet value, maybe using some ties as well. So I'll be right back. All right, so off screen, I made a couple little musical examples here. This first one uses dotted values and tied values extensively to sort of create offbeat, like an offbeat chord rhythm. It's got a lot of tied notes. You'll find in vocal melodies, this is actually this is like a very rough interpretation of an Adele song, but you'll find that vocal melodies will sometimes land on the offbeat, not straight on the downbeat. So let's just give this a listen. Now, we can actually view this in 2 ways, like I've been doing before. I've been hitting this syncopation checkbox over here. And what that's doing is it's kind of getting rid of some of the ties and combining them into other rhythms. So there's different ways to look at it. You know, the examples I draw up in piano roll are very basic looking, but when you actually look at it in music, it's a lot more diverse. You'll have 16th notes next to quarter notes, next to 8th notes, next to tied notes, next to dotted notes. So there's a lot more variation in actual written music than there is in, say, a musical example. If we go over to the next one, this one's got sort of like a I don't know, like a 50s, 60s doo-wop sort of piano rhythm idea. You can see the piano, the right hand in the piano is just nailing out this triplet groove. The bass line's, playing mostly longer notes, but it's when it does move faster, it follows a triplet value as well. So that's dotted values, tied values, and triplet values. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.